My name is Ashley Klein Jimenez. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. You are joining us for our Prevent Connect web conference today, From Global to Local, learning from international prevention programs to inform sexual and intimate partner violence prevention in the U.S. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor U.S., formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor. All right, so we have some objectives for you all today, but I just briefly want to let you know that we're hoping to describe some prevention strategies that are being implemented on an international level outside of the U.S., identify how those global prevention perspectives can really inform work that is happening in the U.S. around prevention, and then think about how global health approaches really expand community level prevention strategies and what that could look like locally and in the U.S. So David, I know we have been talking about doing an international web conference for years, and the day is finally here. It's on your birthday. I want to hand it over to you so you can get this conversation started.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's so great to see so many people joining us today to celebrate my birthday. No, to talk about what I think is such an important topic. So why don't we move to the next slide, please, Claudia? So we are in the middle or near the end, coming close to the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And this is an international campaign that's in its 30th year of being able to recognize, while we need to address the issues of gender-based violence 365 days a year, these 16 days of activism has been an international way of having a call for action that we need to be able to take and move forward. And so during these 16 days, this is something that happens throughout the world, not as much in the United States, but something that we really want to be able to highlight more, and those opportunities of how we can be able to take action and move forward. And so that's where we are doing this as part of the 16 days. The 16 days will end on Friday, which is going to be International Human Rights Day. And so we want to be able to do that. It started with on November 25th with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So let's move to the next slide, please. Now, in September, Prevent Connect, and along with the National Sexual Assault Conference, we held some listening sessions about helping support the development of a United States National Action Plan on gender-based violence. And this is something that's actually been informed from international work, and that countries throughout the world have been developing national action plans on gender-based violence, yet the United States has not done so yet. And so the current administration is working to develop a national action plan. We asked for input from the Prevent Connect community. You'll notice that there's some of the listening sessions that we did. I think, Ashley, there's a blog also where we had sort of a summary of that, which I put in the notes. You can post that one also. And we want to be able to encourage people to do this work. I know on Friday that I'll be moderating a panel around prevention, which would be another session as we continue this. There'll be more opportunities for your input into a national action plan on gender-based violence, of which prevention is important. It's important because we need to learn lessons from what has been going on around the world to strengthen the work we're doing here in the United States. Next slide, please. Now, I've had the opportunity to be part of many different international exchanges around issues of preventing gender-based violence. And these are some pictures from Pakistan. Actually, 2 years ago for my birthday, I was in Pakistan with a delegation looking at actually particularly the role of sport in preventing gender-based violence, and had an opportunity to meet with many people throughout Pakistan and looking at those experiences. And I've done this in many different countries and have had the opportunity. And what has always struck me is that I'm going there from the United States to other countries but and able to share the resources and ideas we have. But in so many ways, what it's doing is it's teaching me much more than what I feel I'm always bringing there. We're bringing together a community which is very valuable for people throughout the world to be part of an international community. But I'm learning so much from those international efforts. And as I go, whether it was in South Africa or it was in Denmark or it was in Pakistan, places that I've had the opportunity to go to, is that there's a chance that I've been able to learn. And there's so much power and strength. And that what we'll be doing today is talking about some of what that great knowledge is around how to prevent gender-based violence from around the world and think about what we can use for in this country. And I know for me, it's been really important. In particular, I've really learned a lot about how internationally the issues of gender-based violence are not as siloed from other issues, whether it's going to be economic supports, or it's going to be HIV prevention, or it's going to be girls' education, and that the United States has very siloed approaches that are often dealt as very separated. And what we're doing is it's much more connected. And I think that's such an important piece for us. And the other part that I really learned from international work is that it's much more looking about how to make community level change and how to be able to use families and communities to be able to create the change. Whereas in the United States, so much of our effort is focusing on individuals. And that is, I think, an important lesson for, especially for those of us who do public health work, who believe in community level work, and that I've been so inspired and learned so much from the work that's been happening in other countries. And so that's where the idea, the genesis of this web conference is to be able to take those lessons learned, and people aren't always applying them. Next slide, please. So for example, we recently, in June, did a web conference on gender transformative strategies to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. And it was looking at a program called Manhood 2.0. Manhood 2.0 was a program that Promundo put together that was designed for young men in Brazil. And then it was adapted for implementation in the United States. And I think that we want to spend more time thinking about how we can take those lessons learned in other countries and think about how we can apply it to the United States. Obviously, the United States is a different place than it would be in, for example, Brazil, but there's so many pieces that we found can be relevant. And also remember that this is a country of a wide range of peoples and very diverse, and that we have many immigrants and to this country, or people that are first generation or second generation immigrants that has impact. And there's also a wide range of communities. And so we need to have a wide range of responses, and internationally helps us learn where we can go. So that's where the spirit that we're bringing into what we're going to be talking about today. So let's move to the next slide, please. So Ashley, let's go to our audience first. What want to hear from you? What are the prevention strategies and approaches you're currently implementing? What are you doing? What are those approaches? I know many of you have been, use things such as the CDC's technical packages to inform the work, but just go ahead and in the chat, let's write what you're doing. So, Ashley, I'm seeing people talking about bystander programs like Green Dot, or Safe Dates, which is an education program done for middle schools. I see Mentors in Violence Prevention, which I know is actually being implemented internationally, and same with Coaching Boys and Men and Athletes as Leaders, and more Safe Dates, Safer Bars, youth programs in school, DV training, the One Love Foundation, Dating Matters, more Coaching Boys and Men, teaching a course on IPV, the 10 to 10 hotline, girls empowerment, safer, smarter teens. I'm joining you as more Green Dot, more Expect, Respect, more Relationship Spectrum, and Step Up, which is another bystander program. Holla Back, which has also does work internationally. Dismantling Oppression to Empower All, training and support groups. So it's been able to do this. The Johns Hopkins University Desk Guide for leaders in international abuse prevention, really great resource. I know we did podcasts actually about that program. So Ashley, I'm seeing a lot of people, transformative justice, consent programs, decolonial work, campaigns to destigmatize people who do harm so they can be able to seek help. So Ashley, I'm looking at this list. There's a wide range of different approaches and programs that people are using in this country. And I think it's going to be interesting to see as we now look at this list, community mobilization, actually talking about the Close to Home program, which I know Enrica is talking about, and Safe Dates, and bringing in the bystander, another bystander program. So great, this is wonderful. Keep on doing it. It's great to see what people are doing, from podcasts to different curriculums into more community-based programming. Let's move to the next slide, please. So Ashley, let's welcome our guests. I'm really honored to have, Ashley, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guests?
Sure. So I want to introduce you all to our guests. We'll be hearing from Chelsea Ullman with the Global Women's Institute. Lori, Lori, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name. You'll have to correct me, from Raising Voices, and Avni Amin from the World Health Organization. So we're really excited to introduce you to Chelsea, Lori, and Avni. We are going to, I think, Chelsea, we're going to invite you to share about some of what you know about what the research is telling us in terms of strategies and approaches happening globally. So we will pass this over to you, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and it's a real pleasure to be here. As Ashley mentioned, I'm Chelsea Ullman. I'm with the Global Women's Institute at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And we've been around for about 10 years, and I'm there with my colleague, Mary Ellsberg, who has worked on violence against women and girls for many decades. But at the Institute, we focus on research on violence against women and girls globally. So you're about to hear from Lori and Avni about some really cutting edge work on global prevention of violence against women and girls. So I thought what might be useful from our perspective at the Institute is to just give a very brief overview of the current state of the evidence of violence against women and girls prevention work, sort of setting the scene as we think through what might be useful lessons that we in the US can take from the work going on around the world, and particularly in the Global South. So Claudia, next slide, please. So a few years ago in 2014, we at the Institute conducted what's called a systematic review of reviews of interventions to prevent violence against women and girls. That was later published in the medical journal, The Lancet. And this was really just to better understand what interventions around the world to prevent violence against women and girls have been evaluated. What do we know works? What's the current state of the evidence? Next slide, please. And what we found in this review of reviews was that up until recently, most of the evidence globally comes from about 6 countries, and all of those were high-income countries. One of them, of course, was the US, in part because of funding that comes through VAWA that has sort of created this space for more evidence building on prevention. But we also found that though the stated objectives of many of the interventions that we were looking at in this review were to reduce violence against women and girls, most of the interventions we were finding were actually more about response rather than prevention. So primarily health sector interventions, things like batterers treatment and things like that. And many of the interventions we found that had been evaluated either showed inconclusive results about their effectiveness or didn't show effectiveness. And this is largely because of problems with the methodology and design of the research. A lot of these had sort of small sample sizes and were underpowered from a research perspective. And interventions were also often minimal in terms of their length and their intensity. So things like one-off trainings for health workers or police, or screening policies at a health clinic without additional services in place, or maybe a single talk at a high school or for college students about preventing sexual assault. So we were seeing these sort of shorter term, less intense interventions. that were being evaluated. And then finally, in terms of the evidence base, there was a much heavier focus on intimate partner violence than any other form of violence. So much less attention to other kinds of violence against women and girls in the evidence base. Next slide, please. But what we found from the research in low and middle income countries was that there was a much greater focus on prevention and more community-based interventions going on in low and middle income countries. More kinds of violence against women and girls were being addressed and studied. So things like child marriage, female genital mutilation, FGMC, sexual assault, and that there were also interventions that had more engagement of men and boys as well as women and girls. And perhaps most importantly, interventions that were really trying to address the root causes of violence, really change social norms and address the gender inequality that gives way to violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. And from all of this, so from the review I just described, which is a few years old now, there's been several more reviews since then, and there's been more research on prevention globally in the intervening years. What we do know is good news, and it's that violence can be prevented. And we know that effective interventions to prevent violence include women and men, that they engage the entire community, that they tend to combine multiple approaches as opposed to just taking a single approach. So things like combining group training with a livelihoods intervention or with social communications campaigns. You heard me mention intensity and duration as being important in the intervention. So we know that interventions that are 6 months or longer tend to be more effective in sustained change around violence. And of course, really important that effective interventions really address those social norms regarding the acceptability of violence. So as I mentioned, you're going to hear from Laurie Michaud after me in programs like SASA Together, which are really doing this work to change social norms around violence, and hearing about coordinated efforts like the Respect Framework, which Avni is going to talk about. All of these are really effective approaches to prevention that we better understand now from the research. Okay, and now we're on the next slide, which is, so as we've been building this evidence around what works to prevent violence against women and girls, there has also been global change around law and policy. So you can see here over the past several years, there's been sort of an increase in laws around the world on domestic violence. And you can see that most countries, over 70% of countries, now do have a law against domestic violence. And there are other kinds of policy change happening. You heard David mention the National Action Plan process. We in the US are about to get our first ever National Action Plan on gender-based violence. That's great news. And the Prevent Connect hosted a fantastic listening session to feed into that process. So there's all of this law and policy work going on, but we know that laws aren't enough. And we know that laws, it's challenging to implement laws in a way that really addresses the needs of survivors. So while we need policy change, while we need legal reform, we also really need to understand what works on the ground to create change around violence. Next slide, please. Changing laws is not enough. Next slide after that. So one way to think about this is as an integrated approach to ending violence against women and girls. So prevention, of course, is important. Changing laws and strengthening access to justice is important. Neither of these things stand alone. You need prevention, you need access to justice, you also need strong support services for survivors. All of these pillars are important and stand together and strengthen one another. And then they all stand against this backdrop of what you could call an enabling environment for addressing violence against women and girls. So if we're interested in really addressing violence, reducing violence, we need to think about each of these three pillars and also create the conditions for these pillars to really take root and affect change. Next slide. And just quickly, we know that laws don't pass in isolation, right? Laws, there are lots of different factors that feed into the creation of a law. And I just want to quickly mention a piece of research done by two political scientists, Hatun and Weldon. This was a few years back now, but they looked at data from 70 countries that had laws around domestic violence. And they were really interested in understanding what were the key factors in predicting whether a country had a law around domestic violence. And they looked at lots of different factors. And what they found was that the most important variable in being able to predict whether a country had a law criminalizing domestic violence was the presence of a strong, autonomous, independent women's movement. So the role of the women's movement in reducing violence and ending violence against women and girls in legal reform is really crucial. And so as things become more institutionalized, as we think about scaling up effective interventions and scaling them into across sector work, we really have to remember and cannot forget the importance of the work of the women's movement in all of these pillars. Next slide. So as we continue to build the global evidence base on the prevention of violence, there are a few guiding principles that I think will help us move forward and continue to learn from each other and really strengthen one another's work. The focus on primary prevention of violence, more evidence, particularly building evidence from the Global South on the cost of interventions, sustainability of interventions, and scalability. Looking at violence against women and girls in diverse populations, so Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+ people, migrants, disabled people, and also forms of violence that are under-researched that we know less about, things like femicide, trafficking, and conflict settings, violence in conflict settings. The standardization of data and indicators to measure violence against women and girls and women's empowerment, that's really crucial for comparability across contexts and also over time. And then, of course, integrating violence into existing development platforms and sectors, so things like the education sector, health sector, et cetera. Next slide. Okay, I'm running a little bit low on time, and I'll just mention here that over the past several years, there's been a lot of exciting growth in the global prevention space. So programs like What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls, which is funded by the UK government. This is a multi-million-pound effort to really think about what interventions work to prevent violence and how do we scale those and learn more about what works and how it works. Also, the Australian government, through their Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has invested $500 million over 10 years, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. And both of these investments and other investments have had a really transformative effect on the global evidence base, what we know works and how we can scale those interventions. Next slide. So I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes, but I wanted to leave you with sort of a brief example of where we've seen large-scale social change around violence. And I had mentioned my colleague, Mary Ellsberg. She's the director of the Global Women's Institute where I work. She's been working in Nicaragua for almost 30 years, and she's been able to follow the policy and social changes through research that she's done there over 30 years. And she did the first nationwide prevalence study on intimate partner violence in Nicaragua in the 90s. So she was able to return more recently after 20 years and take a look at, since she did that first nationwide prevalence study in Nicaragua, what's changed? Has there been any change in violence, and what's changed in the country since then? And in the 20-year follow-up study that she did recently, next slide, please, she found that violence did come down, but there was a reduction in violence. In lifetime experience of physical violence from a partner, there was a 63% reduction, which is significant. And then an even bigger reduction in women's experience of violence over the last 12 months, physical violence over the last 12 months, there was a 70% reduction there. Similar reduction in lifetime experience of emotional violence, less change around sexual violence. But all of this is to say that there has been change, and it is possible to prevent violence and create change on a large scale. Next slide. So just to close, in thinking about in the Nicaraguan context, but then also globally, what contributes to change like that, large scale social change around violence against women and girls. In the Nicaraguan context, of course, government action was crucial. A law came into force. There was the creation of women's police stations. There was change around kind of key stakeholder skills and knowledge around violence, police and other actors. But none of it would have been possible without the women's movement and without campaigns for women's rights over that 20-year period. So just to say, again, how important the women's movement is in all of this change around violence. And while these gains can be fragile, we're seeing in Nicaragua and other places some closing of spaces for civil society and some backslide due to government policies and authoritarianism. These gains are fragile, but they can be made. So looking forward to the presentations from my colleagues and continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Was what a wonderful quick overview. I know there's a more conversation and we'll get a chance to come back. Um, let's go to a question to the audience. So you sort of got a broad overview from Chelsea. What are the similarities and differences that you're noticing from the work that's happening in the United States and what's happening globally? Just like to get a sense from you. What is some of those differences and similarities from what Chelsea was sharing with that work? And so, we started with our first question of what are you doing? A lot of that was based on evidence. And so I'd love to be able to get a sense of what we're going to be able to do. And so I'm seeing people starting to go ahead. So I hear your thoughts of what are the similarities and differences between what's happening in the United States and what's happening globally. That prevention work has to have long-term support and funding. The judicial system's not being helpful. More dollars seem to be funneled towards prevention efforts globally than the United States. There's a negative similarity that a lot of the research is being done on women in heterosexual relationships, and the inclusion of LGBTQ is still lacking, and that funding is not enough, that the best practice is multi-level, including entire community and society in prevention. And yeah, that's something that I'm not, I actually see more of that in especially the low-income countries than I'm seeing that in the high-income countries, where it tends to be often more of one intervention. It's interesting that some countries focus on intervention and others on prevention, and that's not what someone expects. Primary prevention needs to be given the same efficacy and resources as secondary and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention being the prevention efforts that prevent violence from happening in the first place, instead of those efforts that are taking place afterwards. We in the United States are starting to think more about changing conditions, and I think that's been a conversation. I know in the soon to be 17 years of Prevent Connect web conferences, we've really seen that shift of being able to move away from how to provide information is what people thought of as prevention, to actually changing the conditions. Agreeing that global efforts are more community-wide and prevention focus. There's interesting things about what are top down and what are going to be, from what type of organizations do it. There's an effort for male engagement is still minimal, and there's still little funding available. So we see some efforts. There is through the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice, there's an Engaging Men's program in the United States, but I think we see some really profound efforts internationally, and I like a lot of the international work really thinks about their work as being gender transformative, which is not a term that we use as much in this country in what we're being able to do. After working globally as well in the United States, I'm seeing that gender-based violence efforts are often focused on cisgender women, whereas prevention efforts need to focus on breaking down the myth that violence is men against women, or only men against women, and that there's the pieces. What does gender transformative mean? So I do encourage you to go to our web conference that I referenced earlier. Gender transformative are efforts that are going to be able to transform the social norms around what gender is, what gender looks like. And so moving away from those normative and often problematic notions of what it means to be a man, I'm putting in quotes, or to be a woman, and that those are often aligned with attitudes and behaviors that are problematic and contribute towards gender-based violence. And so what we want to do is find ways to help transform that. And then it's not just normative, and one of the ways it's normative is being heteronormative. Thank you for bringing this in. And thank you, Ashley, for already putting in another one. We have a few other web conferences on that if you search too. So I know we did one with Ricky Wilkins many years ago around that, with Andrew Levine, Levesque. Great. Well, thank you. So it's great to be able to see some of these reflections about some of these differences. And so that segues really well into really highlight a program that I'm really excited to have. And so we have Lori is going to be presenting about some of the work that's been taking place in Uganda. And I've had the opportunity of being a fan of the research on this work and hearing about this work for many years. And I think it's just really exciting to think about community mobilization efforts and really finding ways for communities to take action to change communities. And so I'm really happy that we have able to have Lori join us to share about the work of SASA Together and Raising Voices. So Lori, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It's really lovely to meet such a diverse and different group of people than we usually speak to. So nice to have this bridge building. I'm going to, as David said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do around mobilizing communities to prevent violence against women with SASA Together. Next slide, please, Claudia. So SASA Together is an approach that really seeks to engage the whole community. SASA means now in Kiswahili, really emphasizing the urgent need to prevent violence against women, and together is really about that it has to be done collectively with all of us. Next slide, please. And I'm going to show you a little film because it's nice to see the context, right? It is a very different context, and you can also see some of my colleagues who couldn't be here today because
so my wife got me this weird new tool.
They are sound asleep right now,
first,
I hope.
I thought it looked kind of crazy.
So we will start the video, and then you can get a little bit of a sense of the feel of the approach. Thanks, Claudia.
In this part of the world, most especially here in Uganda, women and men are valued differently. Society has heaped privileges on the men, while the women are looked at as subordinate. SASA is a community mobilization approach to prevent violence against women and HIV and AIDS. When a woman is experiencing violence, especially from her partner, she's really unable to keep safe from HIV. Men have power to decide how, when, and where sex should be done. And the woman is at risk of being infected because she cannot say no, or she cannot stop the man's adulterous ways. SASA means now in Swahili. It's an urgent problem, so start now.
Kale twalinga tuyombayomba nga tetusobola kubeera nga twekontrolinga.
Kyokulabirako nti omukyala bwe yabanga ageze oluusi okukola ngaawo naddala eti nga nze ndowooza nti ava mu buyinza nga nkuba.
Naye ensonga ze baaleetanga ezisinga ng'era olaba zeekuusa ku buyinza obusukkiridde, tewalinga ngabana ya buyinza mu maka.
Power is not only the problem, but also the solution to preventing violence against women. We are making it personal. Everyone connects with power. Every day, people are living with power or grappling with power. They find themselves within this whole conversation.
There was no blaming of anybody in the communities. No one was accusing anybody, but we were generally helping people to think about their power.
SASA is activist-led. It's not workshop heavy based. It comes away from the traditional programming of organizations going to do things themselves. Instead, organizations support activists who do the activities with their neighbors, their friends, and then it continues to diffuse.
N'olwekyo kizibu nnyo ate okuddira omuntu gw'oyagala omugye ku mirimu gye gy'akola ajje ku lulwo. Kyenva nsalawo nze nga nakyewa ntambule ngende gye bali mbatuuseeko meseji zange bazifune nga nze bwe njagala.
Namba 5 wano ndaba nga bali mu kuteesa ku by'okukozesa akapiira tawa.
Namba 6.
Individuals, local leaders, institutions, the police, and the healthcare workers, they are part of this. And if you're working to create norm change, there has to be change at all levels.
Okusookera ddala mu kuŋŋamba nali sikakasa nti binaatuyamba era nali sikikakasirizaako ddala.
Namutuuza ne twogera tetukikkaanyaako nitubeera nga tukikola nitubeera nga mu kukikola nitubeera nga tuli bulungi bafunamu enkyukakyuka.
Often we've thought that it takes generations or centuries to change, but SASA shows us that preventing violence against women is possible within a relatively short time. It's giving us a systematic way in which to do this work. It is exciting, it is challenging, but working intensely with the communities, we can actually see change happening.
Thanks, Claudia. I'll stop typing now. I could get distracted a little bit. So thanks. Next slide, please, Claudia. So that gave everybody a little bit of a sense, hopefully, of SASA Together, kind of what it looks like in communities. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about the journey of how we got here. We've been working on mobilizing communities to prevent violence for very many years. And so in 2008, SASA was published. And then we actually did an RCT, a randomized control trial on SASA, because we felt that there was so much change happening, but we had stories and we didn't have, strong quantitative rigorous data that showed the impact. And so we did a study. I'll share the results of that in a little while. And then after that, there's been really rapid global uptake and a real emphasis too on practice-based learning. So what does it mean to actually do this work? And what we learned through that is there were many things that were positive about it and many things that we were missing out. And so from 2018 to 2020, we really kind of redid and rewrote and revised SASA into SASA Together and published it in 2020, just as the pandemic was hitting. And it's being used across the world, not because we go out and say, please use this in your communities, but everyone who's interested comes to us, and we help organizations who are already doing violence prevention in their communities are grounded and really work in solidarity with their communities to help provide some structure to their work and to their programming. It's now in 5 different regions, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. So, and it really focuses on those core issues, and I'll unpack that a little bit more too. Claudia, next slide. I think the important thing to learn about this one, or just to mention, is a little bit about what David is saying. SASA Together does not try to just impact participants who might come to a session or a drama or a workshop or whatever the activity is, but really population level change. So we're really trying to impact the norms across the community. And this SASA was the first trial in Sub-Saharan Africa of a violence prevention program to assess and achieve community level impact. And that's really important. So the study was done at a household level. Next slide, please. So in the randomized control trial that was done in collaboration with London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the level of physical partner violence against women was 52% lower in SASA communities than in control communities. This was after programming of about 3 years in communities. So within project, reasonable project timeframes, not generations, which is what we always used to think. Another result was that 28% more women and men in SASA communities thought that it was acceptable for a woman to actually refuse sex. So again, talking about the power issue that somebody mentioned in the chat, and also changes in concurrent partners, which is a chronic and very difficult issue for women in relationships in the region. And we put some links for, there's a lot of papers and a lot of things written up about it if you want to learn more. Next slide, please. So SASA Together, what is this? This shows a little bit about the theory of change. It works within 4 different phases. to really try to impact change across the spectrum, from women and men in communities all the way to institutions. And we do this not kind of jumping in with telling people how to take action, but really through a slow collaborative process that helps people really connect with the issue, think about it, and figure out what change they might want to make in their own lives, as well as working within with individuals in communities, but also with the leadership of communities, and also within the institutions that they support. And I'll unpack this a little bit. Next slide, please. So the essential elements of SASA Together are 4, and I'll unpack each one of these, but a benefits-based activism, a gender power analysis, phases of change, and then holistic community engagement. And you heard Tina and Jojo talk a little bit about some of them, and I'll unpack them a little bit further. Next slide, Claudia, please. So the first is around benefits-based activism. I think that often when we do violence prevention work, we really go in about the statistics, the doom and gloom, like this is a terrible problem, and we sort of sigh and think what to do. SASA Together, what we've realized through the years is that we really have to provide hope and aspiration to something better for people. And so we really try to help people, encourage people to develop their own activism within, to speak up and lead change and feel part of something that's bigger than themselves and ourselves. It really emphasizes the benefits of nonviolence rather than the consequences of violence in order to inspire change. And it really tries to identify individuals and groups in the community who really feel compelled, not to work for an organization, but in their own lives to engage with their friends, family, neighbors, colleagues about this issue. Next slide, please. So we also use a gender power analysis. So I was mentioning in the chat, once, for years, Raising Voices was working and using words like women's status or gender inequality or human rights of women, and it was not really landing. And we were not really able to sort of puncture the idea that this is a women's problem, or that it really did involve everyone. And once we started to change the discourse and use the discourse of power, things changed so much for us. And so, and use the whole spectrum of power. So often when we work on violence against women, we think about power over, and that leaves people in sort of like slightly hopeless despair kind of feeling, and feeling of oppression. And so what we really do within SASA Together is really start by talking about power within, the power within all of us. Then we do go on to unpack in the next phase the men's power over women and how that impacts and the community's silence about it. But then we don't stop there. And oftentimes we were stopping there. Like, okay, once everybody knows, they should really, like, this will just resolve itself. That doesn't really work that way. And so the next phase is really trying to help people join their power with others to create a whole environment that helps people feel like change is possible, and they will not be sort of marginalized because of change, but they will be supported. And then action, really help people through the nitty gritty of how to change dynamics in relationships, how to use our own power differently with various people. So it really tries to address the root cause of violence against women is this power inequity, both at the individual level and at the community level. Next slide, please. And then we work through the phases of change. So many of you, I know, are from a more public health background. So SASA Together tries to fuse feminist human rights activism with public health. And so what we do is we know that many people change across the world in very similar ways. And so what SASA Together tries to do is scale this up to the community level. So, if you are familiar with the contemplation, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation for action, maintenance, it's the same thing, but we scale it up for a programmatic level at the community level. And that sort of systematic way allows organizations not to sort of jump in at the end a lot of the times what we were doing is, you know, you think, okay, violence is a problem, and you start saying that, and then what to do about it. But it really requires people to come to it on their own and go through their own process of understanding and analyzing what that problem means to them in their own lives. Next slide, please, Claudia. So you are also probably very familiar with the ecological model. We really use the ecological model in our programming. So really, you know, trying to take theory and make it alive into programming so it can work for us and help structure and systematize our programming. So within SASA Together, each of the different levels of the socio-ecological model, from the interpersonal to the community to institutions and society, we really try through each of the different strategies, which I'll talk about next, to really try to reach out to all of those groups so that we can build a critical mass for change, and like build that momentum so that there can be change at a population level rather than just an individual level. Next slide, please. So then how do we do that? We use 3 different strategies, and they link very closely with the ecological model. So in local activism, this is led by community members, just regular men and women selling chapatis on the side of the road, you know, being a motorcycle taxi driver, everyone just in the community. They don't need anything special. They don't even need to read and write. It's just somebody who cares about what's going on in their communities. And instead of just, instead of setting up separate activities or big programming, what we do is we just help them integrate it into their regular life. So if they're waiting by the water point to collect water for the day, they're chatting with their neighbors and friends. They have materials that can help go and engage different people, whether they're at their women's group or at the bus stop or wherever. So it's very informal activism, and everything from poster discussions to dramas to couples processes called deeper discussions, games that can be played, all sorts of things to really help people, not to message around violence, but to help people critically think about what it means for them in their own lives. And then we have the community leadership strategy. So this includes leaders, both formal leaders and informal leaders. So like we have marriage counselors that are traditional entities that give advice before marriage to everyone from landlords to religious leaders to public health health providers, all sorts of people who can use their platform and are very powerful as gatekeepers and opinion leaders in communities to influence how people think about violence and how it's responded to. And then the institution. So a really important strategy, because we know that when change happens at the community level, if institutions don't support that change, then people can become very frustrated and change gets stalled. And so how can the institutions that people rely on really be responsive in terms of prevention and response to violence against women? So improving their protocols and policies to better support violence prevention. Next slide, please. So we also have to then figure out what's happening as we go along, rather than waiting for kind of end of year or end of project or external consultants. SASA Together really provides tools for activist organizations to learn and make adjustments in real time. And this is really critical for safety and for ethical engagement with communities. We can't wait till the end to see what happened for people. How are people experiencing things? So we have this very simple cycle and a whole range of different tools that we use to help organizations figure out what's happening in communities as they go along. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what it looks like in the start phase. So again, so that it's, I'm not a researcher, and most folks in activist organizations doing this work are not researchers. So how can we simplify it? And every phase within SASA Together has what we hope that changes in what people know, what they feel, and what they do. And these 3 things are so critical, because if you know something, but if you don't feel it or aren't compelled to do anything about it, that all the knowledge in the world isn't going to really matter. And if no one feels something, but you don't know what to do around it, it also sort of ends up just dissolving. And so really trying to promote both all of these, know what people know, feel, and do within each phase, according to the type of power and work that's being done in that phase, is how we structure the learning processes. And I put some links in case you're interested around the LMA framework and the outcomes for the different phases. Next slide, please, Claudia. So just some broad takeaways and learnings. Chelsea mentioned some, and Avni will be mentioning, I'm sure, some of these as well. But really, social norm change at the community level works. We've seen not just SASA Together and evidence around SASA, but there is more evidence now about how community level change can happen, and can happen within project timeframes if we do it intensely enough and through a multiple different communication channels. It can't just be one or two groups or people getting out there and speaking. It really has to come from all angles all the time, that we really need to move beyond beyond information and awareness into really helping get personal with people, help them think about what this means for their own lives, and help them really figure out how to be different, how to make changes in their own lives. And you know, SASA Together is not a blueprint. It's not, okay, go do this. It's a structure that people can use, because long-term change, and anyone who's done community organizing in communities knows that it is a very messy and unlinear process. Whoop, that's my time. I'm almost finished. And so, so that SASA Together is a guide to help people sort of stay structured and stay on track to help us move forward. But it does require being held, communities holding this work, and organizations holding this work to work in solidarity with communities. And I think I'll stop there and pass back over to David. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lori. And these are such great principles. I see some great questions in the chat. I'm actually going to hold on them because I think they're going to be ones that I'd love to have everyone's reflections on, not just Lori. So let's move to the next slide, please. Oh, this is here. You get information about SASA. Next slide, please. So I want to go to you in the audience. Part of what we're doing here is we want to think about how we create bridges for people who are doing this work throughout the world. So what are your ideas? So we'd like to get your thoughts. What do you feel about becoming more engaged in an international community to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence? A lot of times we do things that are in the United States. We focus mainly on what the United States is, but I think that by bridging, you know, Lori referenced this is a different community than she normally speaks with, and then I think that it's really great. So I'd love to just get your thoughts about what are some, you know, what do you think of how or what you would want to be doing in engaging with others who are doing this on an international level, and thinking about this. We're sort of trying to expand our networks and have the opportunity. I know that Prevent Connect, we have people joining us from around the world, because though timing is always hard to do, but I know that we've had some of these pieces. I know that there's been networks in New Zealand and India who have found our pieces helpful. So some, Heather talks about resource sharing, connections for international sister organizations. Bring better ideas and perspectives globally. I think that's exactly why we're wanting to do this session, is to bring the best ideas forward. There were questions, Lori, about how, if this has been adapted in the United States, and some of these elements are community organizing models that have existed in the United States, and some of them are just put together as a platform that we can see very common. So I know, for example, the close to home organizing uses the 4 stages that are, you know, the same of that change. Oh, people are really writing in now. So here, follow and join Indigenous movements globally, to be able to meeting one person who's it'd be great just connecting with other people who do things that are similar. Someone talked about they're taking students to Costa Rica in the spirit of study abroad, but they're looking for IPV resources available at multiple levels. to be able to have a round table of international preventionists. That's what we're sort of doing here today. There are lots of gatherings of international preventionists, which the United States prevention practitioners are generally not as aware of, but these meetings happen all the time. And there's been a lot of really great resources, and we at Prevent Connect are going to work on trying to bring more of them. Sharing information about international issues like discrimination against disabled and LGBTQ communities that impact gender-based violence. Jamie makes a really important point. It's to consider is not trying to impose our values, wants, and needs onto other cultures, and respecting others' cultures, traditions, and values. And I think that's a really important point. And I know that's what I find sort of strange of being part of a delegation going to the other countries, is that I know that a lot of the strategies we're doing might not work there, but can move forward. Work with faith communities and be able to show that. So great. Well, thank you so much. Let's move to the next slide, please. I know our time suddenly goes fast, and I'm really happy to introduce Avni, who is going to be from the World Health Organization. And the RESPECT framework is, I really have great admiration and respect for the RESPECT network framework. Sorry for the bad pun, but I think it's a really great framework that gives us a sense of how to be able to do the work. And I really love the way that the concepts have been so well articulated, and I think clarify what are the elements that are so valuable in being able to do prevention work. So Avni, I'm going to pass the podium over to you.
Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's around 9 p.m. in Geneva. I'm based in Switzerland at the WHO. And I'm going to share with you the Respect Women framework. And the framework is really a culmination of what Chelsea presented in terms of the global evidence base on prevention in terms of what works, as well as drawing on the work that Laurie and many other groups like Raising Voices have been doing on the ground to really bring to the table what can we learn from practice-based learning, and trying to put it all together in a unified framework. To provide a little bit of a context for this, we've been working at WHO for the last 25 years or so, and largely our mandate has been to work with ministries of health and policymakers. And we realized very quickly that data and evidence was really key to getting this issue on the table of policymakers. So we started working initially on gathering prevalence data worldwide, and then slowly built towards synthesizing the evidence on what works, as well as what works to respond to violence against women through the health sector. And the idea for the RESPECT framework was really that how can we take and package everything that we're learning from the data and from the practice and make it accessible to policymakers so that we can actually help them scale up in a very mindful and thoughtful way, evidence-based efforts to really, achieve what Chelsea showed in Nicaragua, population-based reductions in violence, and hopefully in less than 20 years, I'm optimistic, but still, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So next slide, please, Claudia. I'll just start with what we know about the global prevalence, and I think it's important to flag that because of the context. I'm sure many of you have heard the 1 in 3 figure being sort of used quite widely now, and that is really what is behind the 1 in 3 figure is data that's coming at this point from over about 161 countries worldwide on prevalence of intimate partner violence, so physical and or sexual violence in the lifetime for women 15 and older. And then more recently in the past, in 2021, we also looked at the data for the adolescent girls and young women age group, and the data for that we found was about 1 in 4. Before you move to the next slide, Claudia, I just wanted to maybe share my screen for 1 minute and just show you what the prevalence looks like worldwide across different countries so that people have a sense of what is the context. Just in the same way that Laurie showed a picture of the context in Uganda, I thought might be useful to look at the different contexts in terms of the prevalence data that we have worldwide. So just give me a second. Okay, can you see the heat map here? Can you see the global map? Yeah, okay. So this is a database that we published earlier this year, which is called the Global Database on Prevalence of Violence Against Women. And we have at the moment data from 161 countries on intimate partner violence for both the 15 plus age group as well as the 15 to 49. And for two types of data, lifetime prevalence as well as the past 12 months. And obviously, the darker the yellow and the darker the red, it just means that the bigger the prevalence data are. So just for the US, I'm just going to click on this, and what you will see, oops, here. For the US, you can see that for the past year, 12 or the last 12 months, the prevalence is 6% and lifetime is 26%, as most of you know. But I'm going to slide over to where Laurie has been working, which is in Uganda. Oops, here, yeah. And you can immediately see the difference in prevalence. And here we are looking at the last 12 months prevalence, which is 26%, and a lifetime prevalence of 45, or nearly 1 in 2. And you can sort of then get a sense of just the scale of the problem we're talking about. If you move, and I'll try and pick a very dark red country, and here is Papua New Guinea, which is colored really deep red, you will see that Papua New Guinea has a prevalence just for the last 12 months of 31% and a lifetime prevalence of 51%. So just the enormity of the scale and the levels of population-based reduction we need to achieve in Papua New Guinea or in Uganda versus what you might have to do in the US will give you a sense. Here we're talking about single-digit prevalence, and here we're talking about almost 1 in 3 women in Papua New Guinea. So just thinking through that is an important contextual factor in what needs to be done. If I can I'll stop sharing and ask Claudia to go back to the slide deck again. Great. Next slide, please, Claudia. Thank you. Okay. So as I said, Respect Women was developed as an interagency, a unified framework. It was initiated by WHO and UN Women, and we brought in 12 other agencies who endorsed this framework, which includes the UN Office for Drugs and Crimes, the UN Population Fund, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN Development Program, UNAIDS, the World Bank, USAID, Government of Netherlands, UK, Australia, Sweden, and Canada. And our target audience was really policymakers. That was the primary audience that we were aiming to reach. However, we also know that practitioners, implementers may also find this useful. Next slide, please. So what Respect is really a roadmap guiding policymakers to think how would they design and think about prevention. Starting with knowing their epidemics in their local context, to assessing their risk and protective factors, to thinking about 7 strategies. Each of these 7 strategies are basically each letter of respect stands for one of the 7 strategies, and I'll walk us through that. Really thinking about what is the evidence we have for the different interventions under each of the 7 strategies. developing a theory of change, as Laurie talked about, and then really thinking about the guiding principles. And I can't emphasize that enough, because I think what we're learning from the practice-based um, uh, efforts is how you implement interventions is as important as what you do. Success really will determine how those interventions are implemented with a thought to issues around power, around intersectionality, and around really generating critical reflections. Thinking about the creation of the enabling environment, it goes back to what Chelsea had talked about. What is the ecosystem that we need to make sure is also strengthened so that these interventions can be maximized for success? And then thinking about what are the lessons we should learn about adapting and scaling up what works when we are, for example, taking an intervention like SASA and trying to make it work in another setting like Haiti, or coaching men coaching boys to men and trying to make it work in Uganda, as is being done now. So really thinking of what is those principles around adaptation, and then the importance of monitoring and evaluating, as and learning as you go, which also Laurie talked about. Next slide. So here are the 7 strategies of respect. The R for in respect stands for interventions that aim to strengthen relationship skills. So really around improved and shared decision making, conflict resolution, communication between partners. The E is really around the empowerment of women. So really thinking about what women need, both economically and socially, and in terms of self-efficacy and confidence. The S is services, and here, of course, all of the services under health, justice, police, social services are included under the S. The P, which is increasingly, we're getting a lot of evidence from a number of countries, is the importance of poverty reduction. We know that for many households, poverty is a trigger for violence. It's not a root cause, but it can be a catalyst. And we're seeing this right now in the context of COVID, where economic uncertainty is playing out in the increased reports around violence. And a lot of the interventions here are around women's employment, cash transfer programs, women's own asset and inheritance and ownership of assets interventions. The environments made safe is really around whole of sort of school environments, working through workplace environments. In some countries and in some settings, there are urban environment interventions such as safe cities, so that public spaces are safer for women. The child and adolescent abuse prevented, which is the C of respect, is really for interventions that we can work very early on in the life course, and starting young with young children and adolescents who might be exposed to intimate partner violence in their homes, or may be subjected to child abuse themselves, because we know that there are very strong links between violence experienced in childhood and perpetration and experience of violence against women. And the T is what Laurie talked about around this whole of community approaches to transform norms, attitudes and beliefs around gender equality and around the acceptability of violence against women. Next slide, please. So drawing on all of the wisdom from all of the interventions that are in each of the 7 strategies of respect, we tried to really put together a simple set of messages for policymakers as to what are some of the guiding principles that maximize success. So even if you're implementing a SASA or a Stepping Stones or coaching boys to men in Uganda, what is it that you really need to pay attention to in order to make these successful? And absolutely one of the first core values is attention to women's safety and doing no harm. Many of the interventions, when implemented from one context to another, even if they are well-intentioned, can cause unintentional harm. And so really making sure that the program is monitoring any unintentional consequences and doing no harm is the first sort of principle. The second is around power, and although I've talked about gender equality and women's human rights for brevity, this is really the core, which is being attentive to the issues of power and having gender power analysis as the core that drives any kind of programming. The third is around the leave no one behind, but this is really about intersectionality and targeting those groups and intentionally making sure that you are including those groups that face multiple forms of discrimination, be it based on gender identity or sexual orientation, or in many settings, it's race, ethnicity, whether you have indigenous women, or in India, where I come from, it's caste, which is one of the big drivers of discrimination. The theory of change, as Laurie highlighted, is equally important as an effective strategy to be sure as to what programmatic change you are aiming to achieve. Are you aiming to just change norms and attitudes? Are you aiming to change behaviors? Are you aiming to change knowledge? So just being really clear about that. Making sure that there are participatory approaches, a lot of what Laurie talked about, things that resonate with people, that are not lecture oriented, but just inspire people to connect in a very personal way in critically reflecting about what this means for them in their day-to-day life, which is really the crux of what participatory approaches are meant to do. The idea of combined multiple programming, at the different levels of the social ecology, something that Chelsea talked about as what the evidence is showing, where things that are, when they are put together at a population level, have far more impact than if you were doing individual programs in isolation of each other. And then really one of the things that I think is important is to remember the prevention continuum. And we made this mistake in the HIV world, where the pendulum swung from prevention to treatment, then it went back to prevention. And I think for the violence against women field, one of the important lessons is because we have, for example, in Uganda or in Papua New Guinea, 1 in 2 women affected by violence, you really can't do primary prevention without also having services in place, because the chances are very strong that as you have change and communities, critically reflect about these issues, more and more women will come forward needing services, needing trauma-informed care. So you really have to have both prevention and treatment or care or response together. And then the last learning has been the importance of a life course approach, and really thinking about how you can start early, working in schools, working with children, working with adolescents, and a lot of the work that is now being done on intersections of violence against women and violence against children is really being driven by this recognition from the data that we have, that you need a life course approach. You need to work with parents of young children to instill nonviolent disciplinary ways. In many countries, there's still a lot of corporal punishment, which sort of feeds into this whole intergenerational cycle of violence. At the same time, you need to work with young people around what consent means, and you need to work with adults, both men and women, around prevention. So it's really that whole spectrum that we need to be working on. Next slide, please. What we're learning from some of the efforts, and I know Laurie will have a lot to say about this, because SASA has been replicated in many, many countries now. And, there are some lessons, both positive and from the negative ways in which SASA and other interventions have been replicated, in terms of what we ought to be doing better when we take interventions from one socio-cultural context and try to implement it in another socio-cultural context. And it's really one of the things that we're learning is being really clear about what is the core that is essential to make that program success. And I think over and over again, it's the core intervention is around those things that really get critical reflection around gender and power. And making sure that when things are transplanted from one setting to another or scaled up from, say, 5 communities to 1,500 communities, that minimum, that there is fidelity to that minimum core set of things that have to happen. Otherwise, you really can't make that program successful at scale. I think the importance of also programming for synergy and making sure that there is combination of if you're working with individuals and communities, that there is also that effort to work with institutionals and societal level institutions. Then thinking about how you're going to invest in capacity among people who are implementing and giving enough time for change to allow it to happen, for the concepts to be internalized, and for the scale up to happen. And this is one of the most challenging things, because often there's a lot of pressure from donors to just say, okay, we need results, in 20,000 communities within 1 year or 2 years. And the kind of investment that is needed that you saw Laurie describing for SASA cannot happen in that way on such a large scale. And it really requires a lot of effort to invest in the capacities of the groups on the ground that are going to be implementing and scaling up. Next slide. And I think this should be my last one. The other sort of learnings are around, and I think some of these ideas have come up in the chat box, really thinking about supporting a community of practice, thinking about how you're going to innovate and design interventions with scale in mind. What are your platforms where you can take SASA and implement it? Maybe it's the village savings and loan scheme in Burundi, or maybe it's self-help groups, which are thousands in numbers in India, but really thinking about those scale platforms that you can use when you want to, take it from a small pilot project to scale. Next slide. Yeah, this is the last slide, and it's really going back to what Chelsea talked about, which is the enabling environment for prevention. And it goes back to one of the things that Chelsea highlighted about the feminist movements. And it's really making sure that whatever we do at the government level invests, builds, and resources the work of women's organizations. And I cannot emphasize that enough. And this is one of the reasons we felt that we had to make that statement as a core enabler for any kind of prevention interventions to succeed. Plus the importance of allocation of resources. For too long, this work has basically been done on the free labor of a lot of activists, and we really cannot afford to, if we had, I think if the violence against women field had the kind of money that the AIDS world has had for decades, I just think about the kind of impact we would have made, but we haven't. And so I just think that we need to stop thinking of this as something that can continue on the unpaid labor of activists and community organizations, and really resource that. Next slide.
And we are running out of, yeah, it's great.
That's it.
Thank you so much.
This is the call to action for respect, and I'll stop here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Avni. And I so highly recommend the report. I even shared some awesome social media graphics that are around the 7 steps, and there's just great information. And there's a video that we don't get a chance to watch. Want to move to the next slide, please, because we are at our final few minutes left. We just want you to start. What have you heard today that you want to think about implementing here in this country? Just want to hear from you. What inspired you? What's that next step? What's something that you're planning to do? We want to hear from you on what ideas, because that was our intention today. I want to So go ahead and write down what are the things, what principles or what thing that you learned today from any of our presenters. Want to move to the next slide while people get a chance to think about that message. I wish we had more time for discussion and we're in our last minute. So I'm unfortunately, because there was a question about how to engage men and some of the ways doing that. We will be recording, this will be posted on the same website where you registered for it, on the Prevent Connect, and we'll have, and it'll take about a week to do it. So I want to really thank Avni from the World Health Organization, Lori from Raising Voices, and Chelsea from the Global Women's Institute for sharing so much. We are committed to continuing this discussion and continuing having people have an opportunity to work together and learn with each other. We want to continue sharing some of the lessons from international work to influence our work. And we want to work on building that community of prevention practitioners so we can learn from and with each other to continue this. As Avni said, this is about evident, practice-based evidence. We have the evidence of our experience of what we're doing. We need to do that. And that's so much of what Prevent Connect is doing. So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. And thanks especially to our audience for all of your great wisdom and thoughts and experiences. And thanks to Ashley and Claudia for their work and Tori for their work on the back end. And thank all of the panelists. And I hope you have a good rest of your day today